So I was recently wondering about what could be some of the worst Magic cards ever. So I consulted Google and I came across this list published on Star City Games that actually listed the 100 worst Magic cards ever. And I was kind of surprised to see what they had at number one. It was this card right here. And when I read it, I thought that doesn't really seem to me like it should be considered the worst card ever. So I wanted to kind of discuss it a little bit and try and figure out some ways in which this card could actually be useful. Let's take a look at it. This card is Pale Moon. It's from the Nemesis expansion. It's a rare. One in a blue instant. It says, until end of turn, if a player taps a non-basic land for mana, it produces colorless mana instead of its normal type. And in this article, the reasoning that's given for this being the worst card ever is that they say that all it does is it shuts down players from getting colored mana for a turn. They can still tap these lands for colorless mana, they can still use the abilities of those lands, and they can still tap those lands for mana in response to this, allowing them to have colored mana during their turn anyway. And those are all valid points, and I'm not trying to say that this is a good card, but what I'm going to try and do in this video is find reasons for why this card probably isn't actually the worst card ever. So what are some things this card has going for it? Well, it only costs 2 mana, which is pretty cheap. It only requires 1 colored mana, being blue. It's an instant, which is a big deal. Also, it says if a player taps a non-basic land for mana, not if target opponent does or anything. So in a 4-player commander game, that could be relevant because it stops all players from getting colored mana from their non-basics for a turn. So the obvious comparison with this card is if you compare it to a much more popular card here, Blood Moon. You got Pale Moon and Blood Moon. Blood Moon, it can basically shut off a lot of decks. It's an enchantment that says non-basic lands are mountains. So, if your opponent's playing lots of non-basics and they need colors which are not red, they can't get those from the lands anymore, so Blood Moon can kind of shut off their deck. Pale Moon does a very similar thing, but only for 1 turn, and I feel like that's more often than not seen as a big downside for this card. I read some old discussions about this card, and a lot of things people were saying was that this really needed to be an enchantment. Well, if that was the case, then it would basically just be another Blood Moon, right? But I feel like there's a way to take advantage of this being an instant, because with Blood Moon, you can just throw it in any deck and it can be good. However, when you do that, this can end up hurting you sometimes even more than your opponents. You can end up shutting off your own deck. With this one, though, this can be basically a Blood Moon which you can activate only when you want. So you could have this active just during your opponent's turn, and then on your turn, the effect isn't in play anymore, so you can use all your non-basic lands to get any color. And only having that effect in play for 1 turn might seem like a very small effect, and it kind of is. However, sometimes that's all that you need in order to start to run away with the game. I would see this as being a tempo card, one that you can use to essentially stop your opponent for 1 turn. But the thing with this is, I could see it being actually pretty good playing against a multicolored deck when you can play it early, because a lot of decks really rely on getting their commander out on an early turn or on a very specific turn. So if you can use this to just shut off the deck for that 1 turn, that could actually be pretty useful. Some of the most popular decks are multicolored commanders, such as ones from this cycle, the Commander 2016, there's Slivers, things like that. Some of these decks actually don't really play that many mana rocks, as well as not really having many basic lands. So I feel like that kind of solidifies the case for this card a little bit, because it's the kind of the corner cases and where it's good do happen to be against some decks which are very popular. Or it doesn't even have to be against 4 and 5 color decks. There are a lot of 3 color decks that this could be good against as well. One of them that I play is this Hinata deck. I find that this deck is very hungry for colored mana, so if my non-basics are basically shut off from providing colored mana for a turn, that can hinder this deck a lot also, because a lot of cards that I play in this are big sorcery spells. And the thing with this being at instant speed is what you would do is just play it on your opponent's upkeep so that, yes, like it said in the article, your opponents can just tap their lands in response to this to get colored mana, but when you play this in their upkeep, they can only use that colored mana in their upkeep. If they go, past the upkeep, the mana is gone and they don't have access to it for the rest of the turn. Another thing about with this Hinata deck is that I could actually see me playing this card in this deck, despite the fact that I said it kind of hoses my deck here. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, how this has something kind of up on Blood Moon in that you can use it in situations where basically you want to have a Blood Moon just during a specific time, because if you play Blood Moon, it's always in play, but this, you kind of get to turn on the Blood Moon when you want. And in a deck like this card's kind of more general attributes can actually be pretty useful as well. Just the fact that it is a 1 and a blue instant, that alone can have a lot of utility, because in decks like this, there are cards like Primal Amulet. It says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, put a charge counter on this. Well, if you've gone past the point in the game where this is going to be very useful for its actual effect, just the fact that it's a 1 and a blue instant can still provide utility, because you can just cast it to get a counter on this. This kind of reminds me of when Prowess was first introduced, I believe, in Khans of Tarkir. There was kind of a running joke in that for every instant and sorcery, regardless of how good it was, you could still say, well, it triggers Prowess anyway. And that utility also goes for any of the other cards which care about casting an instant or sorcery, something like Archmage Emeritus here, where it says when you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, draw a card. Well, this basically just says 2 mana, draw a card at that point. Once again, that's not great. That's not even good. However, it is something that it has going for it. Same with Whirlwind of Thought. When you cast a non-creature, draw a card. And also there's the fact that it only costs 2 mana, so you could imprint it onto an Isochron Scepter if you want. There are much, much better cards you could imprint on Isochron Scepter. However, I could envision scenarios in which having this imprinted onto the Isochron Scepter could actually be pretty decent. Or if you don't want to put it on an Isochron Scepter, there are many cards that exist that allow you to rebuy or recast cards, instants and sorceries out of your graveyard, so this could be useful to have in the graveyard and kind of surprise your opponent with it maybe. So let's try and recap some of the good things this card has going for it. It can shut off multicolored decks for a turn, things like this, or slivers, just color-hungry decks. It can be a big tempo swing early on. It can be a Blood Moon that you can basically have active only for when you want it to be active. It's kind of a Blood Moon type of effect that you can play in decks that would normally be hosed by Blood Moon. Just the fact that it's a 2 mana instant has a lot of value in itself for being able to trigger cards like this, even cards which have the actual Prowess ability. You can imprint it onto Isochron Scepter if you want, and there are also many ways that you can rebuy this out of the graveyard. So with all of these things in consideration, am I saying that this is a good card? No, I don't think this is a good card. But what I wanted to say here is that I don't really think this is the worst card ever. I think there are probably much worse cards than this, because there are some situations in which I can imagine this actually doing a decent amount of work. So I thought it would be fun today to take a card which is widely considered to be very bad and try and come up with some situations in which maybe it could actually be useful. And there are a lot of cards like this actually where they seem really bad, but in some weird corner cases, they can actually do a lot of work. It could be fun maybe to talk about more cards like this. If there are any cards in particular that you think could be interesting to discuss in this way, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to read those. If you're still watching though, thanks for watching. It'd be cool if you can like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. I encourage everyone to come join my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the video description below. And in the video description, you can also find my affiliate links for Dragon Shield, in case you'd like to purchase any gaming supplies. You can follow those affiliate links and help out the channel while you do so. Also, if you'd like to purchase any cards, you can get those by going to face2facegames.com. And if you use promo code 8thPlaceDave, you can save 5% on your order. And I'd also just like to take a moment to thank all the patrons who support me on Patreon. But otherwise though, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.